Hi, everybody. How are you? Can everybody hear me? If you can hear me, just give me a little yes in the chat box. There's a little chat icon at the bottom of your screen. It says chat, so you can open a chat box. Oh, good. Thank you, Kathleen. At least you can hear me, and Bobby. Oh, perfect. Okay. I'm here at my parents' home. This is my mom's office because she's watching my 9-month-old son. I have my husband here, and we're going to just have a really good time. Keep it casual. Welcome to those who were at my last webinar. I'm glad to have you back, and welcome to our new people. I'm excited to be offering this here. Hi, Judy. Perfect. I'm so glad you're here. This is wonderful. All right, a little bit of logistics. Looks like you've already figured out how you got in, so good job. We all got in. And then basically you got the chat box there. That is for you to talk with one another, but also to ask any questions. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to put them in at any time. My husband's kind of keeping his eye on the chat box and the questions that come in. I will too, but just throw them in, and I'll have times where I'll ask you if there's any questions or anything like that, or if you have any comments. That's the place where we'll kind of communicate over the World Wide Web. And the other features you don't really need for my purposes. You don't need the Q&A, and you shouldn't need to do anything else. So that's about it. So we'll just jump right in, and we'll get started. I'm excited about this class. It's one of my favorites because I feel like as genealogists, whether if you just kind of started, and if we have some beginners here, that it's very easy to feel a little overwhelmed about how do I do this? What's the protocol, kind of? What is the steps? And we kind of just jump in because we all have a different reason why we get involved in family history. But there's some really nifty and really important tricks, and it's actually called methodology, and when we in family history we call it methodology on doing family history. And so today I want to offer some of those tricks that I've learned over time that will help you hopefully find those missing ancestors or anything other information that you're looking for. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint here. There we go. And we good? Can you see my, okay, great. So I call this search and rescue because family history is often like being on a search and rescue team. Actually, I've looked at kind of the process. My husband's actually participated before in looking for someone who was lost in the mountains. And I looked up and how the process is kind of done. So when somebody goes missing or whatever, and let's say in the mountains or something like that, usually the first kind of search is they just kind of do this overall kind of search where they figured that the person had been, where they're at, and they just kind of start looking, a few people, however many they have on the team, looking for the individual. And that's kind of the first step, first process of looking for the person. And if that's not successful, if they don't find who the lost individual, then they go back a second time with more detail. They actually start to follow, they use some features like rivers or trails or other things to bounce off on. So they have these bounce off points, I guess you could call them, where they know that maybe people started off from, or maybe that's where they were. And they use those places to then look around, and they start getting really more nitty gritty about things. Maybe they even bring in some dogs to sniff things out, but they use some of these more landmarks to bounce off of, and they start looking off the beaten trail, basically. If that's unsuccessful, then they really get in detail, and this is where they start bringing in volunteers and all sorts of people, and they just like go at it, and you start to look really fine details. You start scanning every little detail that you can, looking for any articles of clothing on the ground, any sort of footprints, looking up below, looking up high. Am I right, Ken, when you did that? I just kind of looking for all these little details, and you just go at it. And more kind of like a fine-tooth comb, you could say, I guess. Family history is a lot like that when we're looking for a lost individual, or we're looking for some piece of information. We get on Ancestry.com or we get on Family Search, and we try to grab what's called the low-hanging fruit And we just type in our ancestor or whatever information that we know into those search engines, and we see what pops up. And maybe it's somebody, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. And we kind of glean what we can from that process. And often we can find, things that match. So we find some records in that process that really help us out. But then we're ready to take it up a notch. And just using the search engine doesn't bring up everything. And we still have these missing gaps in our family tree. And so we have to start digging deeper, and we start using information that we do have to bounce off on, like those trails, like those rivers, like those lakes. We bounce off of those to then go out and look for even more. And then we really start getting nitty gritty when we really can't find what we're looking for, to really use the information strategically to find our individual. So hopefully that makes sense. But family history is a lot like that. And I want to take you through steps 2 and 3, basically. How do we move past step 1? How do we move past the low-hanging fruit to find the information exactly what we're looking for? What I call this being an active researcher. So we look at everything through a lens instead of just this broad, okay, I'm just going to find whatever I can find. We start getting very strategic. Search and rescue is very strategic in how they're looking for these lost individuals. And we're going to do the same thing. If you were in my last webinar, I'm going to repeat a little bit at the beginning here, a few things that we talked about in my last webinar. So it'll be a good review for you. And for those who are new, you'll find this very helpful. But we're going to keep calm and we're going to stay focused. A lot of people, when they start doing family history, get kind of overwhelmed because what they're doing is throwing a dart at their family tree. They put their family tree on the dartboard, figuratively speaking, and they start throwing darts at it, meaning, okay, I'm going to look for this, and then I'm going to look for this, and this looks interesting, and we're just going to kind of go at it. And that's not a good way of doing things because we get very overwhelmed quickly. And so here's an example using the Oregon Trail. I work at the Oregon Historical Society, and we get people who come into the library to learn about, surprise, the Oregon Trail at the Oregon Historical Society. And I've had individuals walk up to the front desk, the reference desk at the library, and they say, hi, I'm here to research the Oregon Trail. And I look at them and say, whoa, that's great. Welcome. You're at the right place. And I try to help them move to another step. So I say, great. What would you like to learn about the Oregon Trail? Would you like to learn about the people on the Oregon Trail, or the women on the Oregon Trail, or the men? Would you like to know about children activities on the Oregon Trail? Would you like to know about the Oregon Trail in Oregon or in, Nebraska? Do you want to know about the Oregon Trail's weather experiences or experiences with the Native Americans? Do you want to know about what time period of the Oregon Trail, right? There's so many different aspects about the Oregon Trail. Then I ask, well, what kind of records do you want to look at for learning about the Oregon Trail? Do you want to look at photographs or drawings? Do you want to look at oral histories, journals and diaries, newspapers, books? The resources are endless. But at the Oregon Historical Society, or any library that you really attend, reference librarians try to get you to become more specific in your search so they know exactly what to offer you. Family history, we often we do this, we walk into the family history world saying, I want to learn about John Smith. And that's great, but we need to get more specific. What do you want to know about John Smith? Do you want to know about his birth? Do you want to know about his death? Do you want to know about his marriage? Do you want to know about his children? Do you want to know about his occupation? And what resources do you want to look at to help you to answer those questions? And so it's all to become an active researcher, or to improve your searching and analysis. You need to become great at setting goals, at analyzing your tree and setting goals to help you stay focused. The more specific you are as you do set these goals and as you do these family history, the more effective you will be. So let's do some examples. First of all, you want to start with what you know. And this process works whether you're a beginning genealogist or if you've been doing genealogy for a very long time. We often start doing family history, and if we get confused or we hit roadblocks, I always tell people, okay, or I tell myself when this happens to me, what do I know for sure? always return back to what you know for sure. And I'll be doing some case studies to teach you about this process. But if you're just starting to do family history, I encourage you to, instead of throwing darts at your family tree, look at the generations recent to you. So maybe you look at your grandparents and you say, okay, I know a lot about my grandparents already. I really know where they lived, where they were born, where they died. So let's move back a generation. Okay, I do know about my great grandparents. I know significant about them. But I don't know about their parents, my great great grandparents. This is where information starts getting sketchy and iffy, and there's some holes. Instead of starting at your great great grandparents, where all those holes are, start with your great grandparents, because that's where you know the information, and you look for records related to them, which will then start you in the process of looking at their parents and learning about them. If we have any roadblocks, then this process, often we get confused in all these dates and places and names. And when that kind of moment happens to me, I stop what I'm doing and I say, okay, what do I know? Okay, I do know that he died in Portland in 1910. I know that for sure. Okay, what records can I use based on that information? And what records can I find that may give me some clues? Does that make sense? Is there any questions about that process? Ken, is there any questions so far? I can't see the chat box as I have the PowerPoint up. Nope, okay. So if that's great, if you're confused at all for any reason or any questions about anything, again, use the chat box. So then, like I said, we look for holes, like the Swiss cheese. Where are the holes? And here's an example of a family tree. And what I mean by holes a little bit could be missing pieces of information, but also information that doesn't look quite right. So perhaps you've inherited a family tree, or maybe you found a family tree online that you're using, somebody else. You want to look for things that may not be quite right. This is a little exercise for you to analyze a family tree. So take a look at these individuals and see if there's anything in there that doesn't look quite right, or anything that might not be right. It may take doing some adding of numbers, and throw them in the chat box. So just tell me certain things that you see in this. I'm gonna see if I can bring up the chat, or maybe you can just turn your computer. Oops, sorry. So go ahead and use a chat box. Do you see anything that maybe somebody's living too long? Whatever it is, use a chat box. Let's see. Okay, good, Bobby. Sarah is married at the age of 10. That's not quite right. I don't know. I guess somebody could be married at the age of 10. No, okay, so good. That's kind of a red flag. What else do you see? Anybody else? Or Bobby, you see another one? There's, Ken says, give them a hint. There's, if you look at some of the children, how long they lived. You notice Alice is lived a very long time. It's like 100 some odd years. Oh, there we go. Now I can use the chat box. Okay. Shelly says, gave birth to the first child at 13. Wait a second. Good. Okay. In family history, maybe you weren't warned. You have to do math in family history. Kathleen says, Alice and Mary were born after John died. Good catch. Awesome. There's several different things in here. They're like, wait, what? Nicely done. A+ for you guys. One other thing is, you notice that Robert's born in Portland, Alice and Mary are born in Portland, but Peter's born in New York. Now, I guess it's possible the family could go bounce back and forth, but it's kind of like, wait, why is the family in Brooklyn all of a sudden, but they were in Portland? Is this the right Peter Smith? Okay, good. John Smith's father has a different last name. Is that him? Is there something going on that's wrong? Good. I just threw in a bunch of like random mistakes in here just for you to kind of think about analyzing a little more. So perfect. There's a few others, but we'll move on. And anyways, this exercise is not necessarily everybody, your family tree is going to have mistakes in it or things that are fishy, but the process is the same. You take a look and you think, okay, John Smith was how old when he had his kids, and he died in relation to the last child, all these kinds of dates and places. It looks like the family lived in Portland, and yada, 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 that kind of thing. So you're really studying about the family and pulling out some pieces of information. You can even put it on a timeline. While we're out here, I'll tell you a little joke. At the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, they have some documents for fun on the wall of letters that they've received from people. And one of the letters was said, "Help, I can't find my grandmother. I think she died at the age of 3." He's like, wait, no, that's not possible. So really have to use your brain when we start doing some analysis. You also want to look for missing pieces or missing pieces of the puzzle. This is very easy to kind of look at here. A family tree, we can obviously tell that we do not have a marriage or a death date or place for George Demosthenes Messagey. We don't have an exact birth date for Catherine or an exact city or county. And so here we don't, that's very obvious, but this is kind of a great place to see, to work on. We can see that there's some missing information. But is you can tell that we have a lot of information about Cassandra. Perhaps she's our grandmother, and we know she was born at this time in this place and she died, but her parents, it gets a little more iffy. So I would start my research on Cassandra and move my way backwards from there. But here's where goal setting comes into place. I set some goals. When was George Messagey and Catherine Fraser married? Where were they married? When did George Demosthenes Messagey die? And where was Catherine born? These are very specific goals, rather again than just saying, I want to learn about George Messagey. Here are some specific goals about him that I would encourage you to write down in some sort of log or format in a way of keeping track of these goals, and to write them down to help you stay focused. Then you want to ask yourself, what record will answer this question for me? So what puzzle pieces match? What records will help? So for instance, the death of George Demosthenes Messagey, some records that would help answer his death when he died would be a death certificate, an obituary, maybe some sort of pension or for his wife, or a will, a testament kind of will, those types of things. Those are records that are very obvious about his death. Cemetery could tell us these are things about his death that would help us. But what are some other not so obvious types of records? Maybe Catherine's obituary, or maybe there's a journal entry by Cassandra that says when her father died. Those are some other records to think about. But the first things we obviously think about are those records that we know could help us answer those questions. After we figure out what records will answer those questions for us, we can then go and look for those specific records. Rather than, again, getting on Ancestry.com, just throwing in George Demosthenes Messagey's name, I'm looking specifically for his death. And more than that, I'm looking specifically for his death certificate, or I'm looking for his obituary. What records or what resources, I should say, what databases can help me with that? So those are a way to become more focused in our search. Here's another tip. Use the information you already have to bounce off on. So again, back to our George Messagey example. I don't know when he died, but I do know when Catherine died. So I'm going back to what I know. I know when Catherine died. So I'm going to look for a death certificate for Catherine, because I know that's when she died. Perhaps her death certificate will tell me whether George was deceased by then or not. I'm assuming he's deceased if he was 110 years old, unless he lived to be 110. I could look for her obituary because I don't know when he died. I don't know where he died. So instead, I'm going to do something that I know for sure, and that's look for her obituary, and perhaps it will tell me when she died. So that's using the information you already have to bounce off on, rather than getting so caught up in looking for a record of his and can't finding it. I'm going to go back to what I know and use that. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? If you do have a question, you can just put a question mark in the chat, and that will I'll let you go, give you some time to write. But otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. So here's an example. If you were in my last workshop, we used George as an example. So we'll use him again in this case study. But I'll tell you what I kind of did with this process. I wasn't sure. I couldn't find, and I was doing a lot of things online. I couldn't find his death certificate. Couldn't find his cemetery on Find a Grave or anything like that. So I looked for Catherine Jane Frazier's obituary. Or first of all, actually, I looked for him in the census records. Couldn't remember what was next. Here are all the census records laid out for him, 1870 to 1910. The last one he appears in is 1910. I'm assuming he died after that because I can't find him. He was old enough to have died. And so I know that he died sometime after 1910. That helps me narrow it down. He died between 1910 and 1920. Here's Catherine's obituary. It says, Mrs. Catherine J. Messagey of Oregon and Washington, pioneer and resident of Thurston County since 1884, died, yada, da, da, da. She was married to the late George D. Messagey in Seattle in 1878 and moved here with him in 1884. Mr. Messagey died in Olympia in 1911. Yeah, there we go. So we're lucky here. Her obituary, we can have a little happy dance in the library, or we're in our home, in our office, that we found out when he died and where. We also found out, along with that, when and where they married. So I update that information. 1878, he died in 1911 in Olympia, Thurston, Washington. Now I can ask for his death certificate from the Vital Records Office because I have a little more information from them. I can say, hey, I'm looking for George D. Messagey, who died in 1911. They send it to me. Here it is. And it tells me that he died December 28th, 1911. That he was a navigator and that he was born January 24th, 1837. This confirms what we've already know. So we're using that information that we know to confirm that we have the right person. We also know he was a sailor. It tells us that he was born in Greece, in a little island in Greece. That confirms what we already know. And it also tells us where he's buried, in the Masonic Lodge in Olympia. Now, because I know specifically a date about when he died, I'm going to use that information to bounce off on. And here I have his obituary. Because I have an exact date, I know when to look in the newspaper. And here I find a funeral notice that tells a little more about him and that where he was buried. Mary Sue, yes, where did I get the census summary? I created that. That was my own little table. After I found all the census records, I put it in a little table. It was actually for a homework assignment when I was in college. But you can do that from home. As you can see, it's kind of a great tool because you can see it over time, all the different census records. So I just created a table in Word and plugged in that information as I found each census record. Really encourage you to do that if you're just starting to do family history, is to find all the census records for your ancestor, because you can glean a lot of information from it. The one in July, my webinar in July, is all about using census records and gleaning information from them and organizing it like that. So if you're interested, sign up for that one. So from this obituary, oh, another question, Lori, how did you contact the State Vital Records Office? You can really get just a phone number. You just Google, I usually just Google like, Ohio death certificates. And usually all of them are at the Vital Records Office. And usually they have a phone number and email, and you can just call them and give them the information you know. They may send you a form. Sometimes online they have a form, or they have an online place to order from. They're all kind of different, each state. But usually it's the Vital Records Office. Good questions. So here he is, buried in the cemetery. Here's his we find out more about is Catherine. So we know we have the right person. But all the records, so here's a little interesting piece of information. All of the records about him say he was born in Greece, except for one census record by his daughter that says that he was born in Turkey. And I was really confused by this until I found his immigration records or his naturalization records. And on it, it says that right here, it says that he gives up his allegiance and sovereignty to the Sultan of Turkey. And I was like, what? What in the world? All right, I know there was the Ottoman Empire, but what's going on? And I was like, I thought the Ottoman Empire was over by this time. What, or was Greece had declared independence by this time that he had immigrated. Turns out that all of Greece had received independence except for this little island that he was from was still part of the Ottoman Empire when he immigrated. So that's a little just kind of some history there trying to find out about it. And he thought it was Turkey. So I have more Turkish blood, really, I think, than Greek blood. That's where this curly hair comes from. Anyways, so that's just a little piece of fun information as you look at it. So that's just a simple little case study. Here's Cassandra's that says Turkey, that she was born in Turkey. But this is gleaning information from other family members that help us to understand more about our ancestor. Any questions so far? Any more questions? Did that answer your questions, Mary Sue and Lori? If you feel like if you need more from your more thoughts from your question, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. The next tip I have for you is to know the records in the area that you're searching. Now, if you're searching in another country, like England or Scotland or wherever it is, we automatically kind of know that they're going to have different types of records than Americans. In England, they have civil registration, it's called. They also focus more on the church, so there's a lot more church records than there are in the United States. And so there's a lot of different records than there would be in America. But each area in America, and each state really, has some unique records to it. We are very familiar with birth, marriage, death records, those kinds of things. But certain areas have different types of records and resources that are unique to the area. So here's an example, and along with another tip, which is revisit your sources over and over. If you already have a census record for Jim Bob, I would encourage you to go back and look at that census and see what more information you can glean from it. If you have some letters, go back and really read those records. If it's been a while since you looked at them, go back to them. Even if it's only been a few days, I sometimes go back and I'm like, okay, I'm really gonna look at this again. So here's an example of the past two tips. Martin Fraser appears in the 1840 US Census in Kentucky, and in the 1860 US Census, he's in Kentucky. But in the 1850 US Census, I can't find him anywhere. And a couple years went by where I couldn't find him in the 1850 Census. So I was like, okay, I'm determined to find him now in the 1850 Census. So I'm going to go back to what I know. What do I know? Okay, I know he was in Kentucky in 1860. So I pull up the 1860 Census again, and I really study it, and I don't know why I never saw it before, but this is why we revisit our sources. And I notice here, it says Milton J. Fraser. Does anybody notice anything that may tell me where he was in 1850 in this census? So it lists him, his wife, and two of his children. Do you see any information in here that could tell me where they were in 1850? Did anybody just throw it in the chat box? Good. All right. James, his son, and the other. Yeah, good. So Eliza are all born in Oregon. I'm like, what? Because this ancestor is not the one I descend from. I'm here in Washington, Oregon. And so I'm like, this is his brother. I'm like, I didn't know he was in Oregon. And I'm like, oh my goodness, in 1855 at least, this is the 1860 US Census. So in 1855, he's in Oregon. For those who are from here, from the Pacific Northwest, what was happening in Oregon in 1850s that would have pulled them to Oregon? Does anybody know? They've got the gold rush in California, yes. Anything else? Free land, that's right. All right, so it was the free land, got the Oregon Trail, exactly. So they participated in the whole Oregon Trail and free land. And so this is where we start to recognize that the Pacific Northwest has a different set of records than anywhere else in the United States, and that is the donation land claims. The donation land claims were basically like the Homestead Act. The government was giving away free land if people would come and cultivate the land. And so there were records that were generated from that event, and they're called the donation land claims. So over here, you can see that this is just an abstract from an index that Milton Fraser had a donation land claim. This is him because I know he was already from Rockcastle County, Kentucky, and that he was this confirms that he arrived in 1852 and that his wife was Georgiana, that I do know that. So that confirms that for me. What states did the DLCs cover? That's a good question. Oh, maybe somebody else knows this. I don't know the specific years. Late 1840s. Most of them I see are like the 1850s. You know, I should know that. Working in historical society. Can we write that one down for me? We will figure it out together at the end, Shelley. What dates were covered by the donation land claim? Good question. So that's an example of knowing the records in your area. We here in the Pacific Northwest know that. We know our Oregon Trail history. That's very familiar to us. But what if you were from, you know, maybe there's some people here from, you know, Florida, and you didn't know that there were donation land claims? You would need to say, you'd say, hey, I have an ancestor from Oregon. What was going on at that time? Were there any records that were generated from that event? And you find, and that's how you find out. So it's really important to find out what records are unique to the area that you're researching. A tool, I don't have a screenshot of this, but a tool that can help with that is called the Family Search Wiki. And if you go to familysearch.org, at the top of the screen, one of the choices is the wiki. And the wiki is like Wikipedia for genealogists. And you can look up any state, any country, and it will teach you about all the different records that are unique to that area. You can also learn when like death certificates were taken over or organized or recorded by the state. So for example, Oregon didn't start recording deaths, births and deaths until 1903. So prior to 1903, the county was in charge of births and deaths. So it's really important to know, because if your ancestor was born in 1902 and you're looking in the birth certificates and the Oregon State birth certificates and you can't find him, well, it's because he was born in 1902 and he's at the county level. And it would be at the county clerk's office. So that's why it's important to know about the records and the dates for the area, the county even, that you're researching. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? It's called doing a locality survey, scoping out what is the dates and the records and resources in your area. All right, next tip is, and this was in my email newsletter if you got it, it's called Complete Whole Families. Here's a actually old picture of my family, several years old, but there we are. And the idea behind this is that we often get focused on one individual in our family tree. Maybe we're trying to move backwards. We're trying to create that big, beautiful fan chart. And so we want to move as far back as we can in our family tree. Well, in that process, we need to actually do the whole family, not the individual. Reason number one is because we're doing family history. We want to work in the whole family spectrum. Let's move backwards in time as a family. The second reason is by researching other members of the family, we learn about the ancestor that we really are interested in. And here, for example, let's say my descendant, my great-great-grandson, is trying to research about me, and he's trying to figure out who my mom and dad are. He doesn't know who they are. And so he looks up my death certificate. My death certificate does not say who my parents are. Darn it. It doesn't say whose parents are. But you, my great-great-grandson, knows that I had a brother named Grant. That's using information he knows. So he looks up Grant's death certificate. And Grant's death certificate tells us that his parents were Dale and Ramona. So that would be my parents, most likely, 99%, right? Sure, those would be my parents. So when we research the other members of the family using their records, this is a really important tip and trick when breaking through roadblocks. If you are stuck on a person or a date and you're having a really hard time finding records, stop researching your ancestor and research a sibling, or even an aunt and uncle or a parent. But you research a sibling and see what information you can get from them, all right? My wonderful husband has sent me that land patents from the DLC were issued from 1850 to 1855. Thank you, Kenneth, my little Googler over here. So there you go, Shelley. The donation land claims were from 1850 to 1855.
And they expired and turned into the Homestead Act in 1862.
Okay, then they became the Homestead Act. Thank you. All right, so here's some examples of completing whole families. Jeremiah Fraser, he moved every 9 years, drove me crazy, but I forgive him. And I'm going to show you a little process of that. Here he is in the 1810 U.S. Census in Jessamine County, Kentucky. I then find him in the 1820 census in, there he is there, just fine. 1830 census, he's still in Jessamine County, Kentucky. I can't find him in the 1840 U.S. Census. But I'm gonna move on. Here's the tax list from Jessamine County, Kentucky. I actually gave a whole workshop on how to use tax lists and land records with him that I will be offering very soon, so stay tuned for that. If you have any early American ancestors. I mean, we all have early American ancestors, but if you're researching those early American ancestors. So here's Jeremiah Fraser in a tax list, and it shows us that he he left Jessamine County, in 1832. So, but here he is in the 1850 U.S. Census in Wayne County, Kentucky. And I know that this is the correct Jeremiah Fraser because his wife's name, was Martha. And also, well, here's Jessamine and here's Wayne in relation to each other. In a land deed, it says that I, James Fraser of Wayne County of the state of Kentucky, basically sells his land to Jeremiah Fraser of Jessamine County. So this is an example of using other records to find out more about our ancestor, but I've confirmed that I have the right Jeremiah Fraser because I find this land record that connects them. Here are some tax lists in Wayne County, Kentucky. So here in 1841, he appears, and that's why I can't find him still in the 1840 census. I don't know where he is exactly, but in 1841, he's in Wayne County. Benjamin Scantland, it's actually Scanland, but this was written wrong, is his son-in-law, along with Andrew Lynch. But here's his son, Garrett Fraser, Whitney Fraser, Jeremiah Fraser, and I follow them along, 1845, 1850, Jeremiah Fraser, here's Benjamin Scanland and his other sons. But 1851, you notice Jeremiah Fraser is gone again. I find Garrett Fraser, and this is an example, I'm having a hard time looking for Jeremiah Fraser, but I look up his son Garrett Fraser. And if you scroll down, I found Jeremiah Fraser, 83 years old, living with his son in Boyle County, Kentucky. Here's a land deed from Wayne County, and it basically tells me that I, Jeremiah Fraser, and Martha, the wife of the county of Pulaski, the state of Kentucky, sell to James Weaver in Wayne County. So this tells me that he, at some point in time, he lived in Pulaski. I think I'm saying it right. So I look up the tax list there. 1851, I find him in Pulaski County tax list, Jeremiah Fraser, Benjamin Scanland, and here's his whole family living in Pulaski. Like I said, I will go in a lot more detail about this step by step. I'm kind of breezing through this in my land records class. But here I'm just trying to show you that he's living with his other family members from county to county. Here in Boyle County, okay, so in Boyle County tax lists, I have Jerry Fraser and his son Garrett Fraser. But there's no census form 1870. He would have been 90 something. I figured that he had died. Now, what about, I'm going to kind of, for time, what about the 1840 US Census? Where was he in 1840? I can't find him. And so I remember complete whole families. Who were the other people in his family? He was living next to Garrett Fraser. He was living next to William Fraser and his son-in-law, Benjamin Scanland. I realize that Benjamin Scanland is a much more unique name than Jeremiah Fraser. So I do a search in the 1840 US Census for Benjamin Scanland. And here's Benjamin Scanland in Tennessee. He's in a county in Tennessee. And I look up in the census, and there's Jeremiah Fraser on the same census in Tennessee. I didn't, when I saw this on Ancestry.com and this Jeremiah, I remembered that I saw a Jeremiah Fraser in Tennessee, but I didn't think anything of it because he'd been living his whole life in Kentucky. But by researching his son-in-law, who I knew lived with him, I found Jeremiah Fraser in the census. So that's using the information that we already know and completing whole families. Who are the other people in his family? I'm going to look up for them. All right, here's all the counties that he lived in. Here's another very interesting example. James William Owen was born 10th of December, 1927 in Arkansas. His father was James Samuel Owen, and his mother was Carrie Leona Scott. I can't find James William in any census. Couldn't find him in the 1930 or the 1940. And what was interesting was I found his father and all of his older siblings in the 1930 census, but not James. Does anybody notice that, I don't know if you already see, that his mother also died in 1927? So and she doesn't appear in the 1930 US Census. So I'm assuming that Carrie Leona Scott Owen died in childbirth to James William Owen, or shortly after in that same year. And I still can't find him. And so I'm wondering, why is he not in the 1930 census? Does anybody have an idea, based on the information that you know, where he could be in the or what would have happened to him in 1930? Does anybody have any ideas? Or what would you think if his mother had died and his father, and he's not listed in the census with his family? Let's see if anybody has an idea. Maybe he died, or there you go. Was he taken by another family member? Perhaps because his father had all these other children to take care of, he sent his youngest baby to go live with another family member. I finally had that same thought. So I was like, okay, well, who is this family member? You know, who it could be, who's one they could live with. So I decided to start with the wife's side of the family. And luckily on a family tree online, somebody else had already done the research on her side of the family. So I had this list here of all these different siblings of who they could live with. who he could live with. And I'm looking at it going, okay, this is a long list. We're going to start with. And I realized that there was more about Viola M. Scott than there. You can see that there's Thomas and John and William, that they have a good, there's a death date, place about them. But I'm going to look for a sister. I'm going to guess that he was sent to a sister. So I started with Viola M. Scott, and I researched her, and I found out who she married, and I looked for her in the 1930 census. So here she is. Zoom in. She was married to a Straight. His last name is Straight. So here's Viola Straight. There are 3 children. And then I noticed a J.W. Straight son, born in Arkansas, 2 years old. I'm like, aha. Number 1, J.W. And this is family members. And he's only 2 years old. Her last child was 10. That's a big gap between Elizabeth and J.W. So I'm pretty sure this is James William, not her own son. But in the census record, they just recorded it as son, and his name was J.W. Straight. That's why I couldn't find a James W. Owen in the census. Now that I have have this information, I look in the 1940 U.S. Census. Here's Viola Straight with a J.W. Straight. And I notice here in parentheses, really tiny, it says Owen. And right here it says that the relationship was a ward. Okay. I would not have found that or have found him in the census record anywhere if I had not researched another family member. So again, if you are stuck, that's the biggest clue I can give you, to search other family members. All right, that's part 1 of my webinar. We're going to move into part 2. Are there any questions at all? Give me just a couple moments. Kind of breathe, get a drink of water. Any questions? Okay. All right, so let's keep going. I'm going to give you some tips on searching databases. Family history has come so far. It used to be that you'd have to write a letter to a library. I'm looking for a blah, 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 sniff, snarf, and I'm looking for a sniff, 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 and sign it, hold it up, lick the envelope, pass it on, even put it in the mail, and wait 3 weeks and hope to hear back, come back, and maybe they'd have a record for you. Thank goodness, yeah, sometimes you have to do that still. But thank goodness most of family history is not that way. Now family history is beautifully, most of it, not all of it, of course, but a lot of it is online. But that brings up its own set of strategies when we're searching on online databases, and every database is different, and there's and so it comes up with its new kinds of tricks and problems when looking for online. And so I'm going to give you some tips on researching databases online. My next webinar in June is how to use specific databases like Ancestry.com and Family Search, some strategies for those. But these are some strategies for some databases in general. So let's first talk about general search engines, I call them. These are ones that just have one field, such as Google. All right, so I actually use Google a lot in family history. I have solved many family history problems and predicaments by just looking on Google and typing my ancestor's name in Google. So here's some examples when using general search engines like Google. Use keywords such as your ancestor's surname. You can use their whole name. You can use words like genealogy, family history. You can also use their place of residence. And so for example, I think I have some here. So here's some examples. James M. Fraser and genealogy. Now, if I put James M. Fraser in quotation marks, I will get any reference on the internet to him that, that lists his name as a phrase, James M. Fraser. If I type in James M. Fraser without quotation marks, I will get every entry for James, every entry for M, every entry for Fraser, and that's a lot. So to narrow it down, I'm going to put in quotation marks James M. Fraser, and then I put the word genealogy. Now I use the word and like that in the search engine, because then that brings up any site that on their site has James M. Fraser as this phrase and the word genealogy. If I don't put genealogy, then it will bring up some things that maybe don't have genealogy in it, but I want and genealogy. Now I could do the same thing for James M. Fraser in quotation marks and Oregon. So I'm looking for a James M. Fraser, not just any James M. Fraser. I'm looking for a James M. Fraser in Oregon. You could also try J. M. Fraser and genealogy. I might type in James Fraser and genealogy. And I want to try all these different ways, not just one of them, because it depends on the site and how it was recorded. You also, what was I going to say? You can also use the surname, just the surname. So my ancestor was Messagey. That's very unique. Every Messagey is related. So I can just put Messagey in Google and see what comes up. I can put Messagey and Seattle, and then I only see things related to Messagey and Seattle. Now, if your ancestor's name was Smith, I don't encourage you just to throw Smith in the search engine. I did know somebody whose last name was Potter, and they were looking for an ancestor, no joke, named Harry Potter. So throwing Harry Potter, even Harry Potter in family history, you don't have much luck. But that's not all of us. So these are some really key tips to help you find things on search engines. And what's great is I have found obituaries this way. I have found family history sites that people have put together this way. I have found just other, types of records and resources just by using these terms. Books that my ancestor is mentioned in. I highly encourage, if you haven't used Google, to use these tips. And I will be sending a handout along with the recording that will have all of these bullet points in them. So if you're trying to write these down, it will be in my handout. All right. Now, when you're searching genealogy websites like Ancestry.com, so you have search fields for the first name, search field for the last name, a search field for where they were born and when they were born, all these different search fields. So some sites like Ancestry.com. One of my tips, my first tip, is to search the specific database you want. And I'm going to pop out of my PowerPoint here to show you what I mean. So here on Ancestry.com, instead of coming here to the main search engine, go to the top and then just search, click on all collections. Okay, and if you scroll down, you get this map of the United States, or if you're searching in another country, you can see these other maps. But here in the United States, and I can click on Oregon, and let's say I'm looking for a marriage that happened in Oregon. I then scroll down and I see that they have a database, Oregon Marriage Index 1906 to 2009. Aha, okay. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to search just the Oregon Marriage Index 1906 to 2009. This allows me to not worry about all this other information that pops up on Ancestry.com that may or may not be relevant. I'm only looking at the marriage index. This does so many things for me. Number one, it helps me stay focused. I don't get caught up in all of these other possibilities. Number two, it helps me narrow down. If I can't find him in this marriage index, either A, there's a transcription error, or B, they're not in there. They weren't married in Oregon, and it helps me know that they weren't married in Oregon. Or perhaps it also helps me know that this marriage index is only from 1906 to 2009. If my ancestor doesn't pop up as with a marriage record, perhaps they were married prior to 1906. But if I was only using the search engine at the front, on the home page, I'd be like, where's this marriage? I can't find this marriage. Well, it's because the database that they have on Ancestry.com for Oregon only starts in 1906. So I need to look elsewhere. There's so many reasons to do this type of research to stay focused. And it helps us know what's available from time period and place, and then to search. All right. So when you're using these big databases like Ancestry.com and Family Search, go to the specific database that will help you answer your goal that you wrote at the beginning. I hardly ever use the main search page on the home page. I only do that at the beginning. All right, does Ancestry and Family Search have the same data? Great question, and we're gonna go into more detail about that in my next webinar, but the answer is yes and no. They often share databases, so they'll have exact same databases on Family Search and on Ancestry.com. However, they have different databases. So Family Search will have a database that Ancestry.com doesn't have, and vice versa. The other thing is you will find on Family Search that for vital records, they often give more information in the index than Ancestry.com does. So if you're looking at like a death index on Ancestry.com, and if you look at that same database on Family Search, you'll often see more information like parents' names that wouldn't be on Ancestry.com. The Family Search is also free. There's a lot of, so I use both. So if you go to Family Search here, the same process is if you hover over search, click on records. And like I said, we'll go in a lot more detail about this in my next webinar and the different features. Browse all published collections. And what's nice about Family Search, I'll just say this now, is they have smaller collections of things. So they'll have like just county records that Ancestry.com doesn't have. And so it's really nice because you can get a little more specific. So then I could say, okay, I want to look at the Alabama State Census 1855 and only look at that collection. All right. Very important to staying focused with your family history. All right. The next one is to, as you use these search engines, I often say, you be specific and go broad. So when you're looking at those databases and you have the field for the first name and the field for the last name and the field for the birthplace and everything like that, just throw in the information that you do know. So, John Smith, born 1855, died this day, blah, 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 blah. Just fill in all the fields that you can and see what comes up. If nothing comes up, maybe it's your lucky day, something does come up, that's right. But if something doesn't, then you would go back to the search engine and take away some information. So maybe you take away his death place, or maybe you don't enter in his birthplace, you only put his birth year. And you do another search and it doesn't pop up. So you take away another piece of information, and so again, the process goes on until you hopefully find what you're looking for. The reason for this is because often, as you probably know, as you start doing your family history, some records have transcription errors, meaning that somebody who has transcribed, and this is a problem with like when somebody is with the internet now, is somebody has to look at these records and transcribe what they see and put it in the database so that you can then search it. And if they did that transcription poorly, if they had a hard time reading it, there could be an error. And so their last name is coming up as Anderson with an O instead of Anderson with an E. Or another reason is when, like, in census records, often the information can be incorrect. So somebody will say that their birthplace is Montana when they were really born in North Dakota. But you were only searching for Montana. And by taking away, or you're searching for North Dakota. So if you take away the birthplace, North Dakota, and leave it empty, but only put the birth field, it gives you a better chance of finding him with the error Does that make sense? So you start specific and move broad, and we have a case study. I'll show you a case study for this. The next tip is, like complete whole families, search for other family members. So again, if you're having a hard time finding your ancestor, look for someone else. Use wildcards, and that's that little asterisk you see there, the little star in your computer above the number 8. I'm sorry, there's a motorcycle going by. This is really handy for surnames that are more complicated than Smith or Allan, my last name. All right. So I have an ancestor whose last name is Messegee, Messegee, right? And when I type that into a search engine, it can be really butchered by either the transcriber or the person who wrote the record. So instead of putting Messegee into the last name, I put MESS asterisk. This will then bring up every entry for anyone whose last name starts with MESS and any variation following after. It's a really handy tool. So MESS asterisk brings up, you can do MESS asterisk S, so that brings up anyone with the last name that starts with MESS, and then any variation in between that and the last S. So you can do it again with any variation starting. You can do this in all sorts of different ways, but the wildcard is really handy. And so it's really handy with the name variations, but don't be afraid if you have a surname that could have a variation like Allan, here comes the motorcycle again. Don't they know I'm teaching a webinar? Okay, sorry about that. So Allen is the most popular form of Allan, but I spell Allan. So using a name variation is key. Any questions there researching these databases so far? Okay. Here, I'm just, for sake of time, I'm just going to tell you this one, George Messegee in the case study, born 1870 in the U.S. Census, or sorry, excuse me, I was looking for him in the 1870 U.S. Census. He was born 1837 in Greece, raised his family in Washington State. I couldn't find him until I used the wild card that I told you about. All right, searching newspapers with general search engines. So often there's newspaper databases that just give you, as you can see there, the search box, just the one, a field to put it in. Here's some tips for that, especially if you're looking at newspapers. Don't be afraid to use keywords, again, that we talked about, such as genealogy, family history, but you really need to use quotation marks again here. Because if you are looking for a newspaper and you just typed in John Smith, you're going to get every John entry and every Smith. I want to look for a newspaper article with John Smith back to back. All right. Use the dates. What I mean by this is the field for dates. Narrow down the newspaper articles that you're looking for. So if you're looking for an obituary, plug in, you can actually sometimes get very specific to the actual days, up to 2 weeks after an individual died. You could type in, just from the year that they were born to the year you died. You're looking for any newspaper articles from when they're born to when they died. Now, with these kinds of databases, when looking for newspapers, you're searching the actual text of the newspaper articles. And it's important to know this because you need to consider, how was the article written? And often in newspaper articles, especially in the early time, in order to save space, for men, they would often just use initials, J.M. Fraser. And so if you're only looking for James Fraser, you're not going to find that article. You might find a different article, but you're not going to find that one. And so it's important to try all sorts of variations with in mind thinking, how did they write about it? So often I will put in I'll probably try M. Fraser, James M. Fraser. Sometimes if I have a unique name enough, or I have other details, I'll just use the surname. So maybe I'll just do Fraser and then narrow down the year. And I'll say, okay, I'm looking for any reference to a Fraser in June of 1851 if I'm having a real hard time. So if you can use some other keywords to help narrow it down. So if you're looking, if you know he was in an accident, you could try Fraser, railroad, railway, explosion. If there was some sort of, accident like that and you're looking for, use these keywords and think, how would it have been written at that time? And this goes along with, like, if you're looking for a marriage announcement, often what they'll do is they'll say, they'll use the surnames first. So they'll say Fraser-Smith. James Fraser was married to Mary, daughter of John Smith, or blah, blah, blah. If you were searching Mary Smith, you would never find that because Mary and Smith were never put together back to back. So that's why I often will try two surnames. So I'll just put in Smith and Fraser. Bring up any entry that has Smith and Fraser in it, because I don't know what was back to back and right along with it. Does that make sense? Can I get a yes? Does that make sense to everybody? That would help me. Kathleen, what newspaper databases do you use? I want to give a webinar about newspapers. My favorite is Genealogy Bank. I think it has one of the largest collection of historical newspapers. Thank you for confirming. I'm glad it makes sense to everybody, because this is a really helpful tip. But I like Genealogy Bank because it has a lot of historical newspapers on it. I've had great success with newspapers.com, which is now owned by Ancestry.com. There's a few others, but those are my two go-tos. There are a lot of libraries, or a lot of libraries will have newspaper databases, public libraries, and the image that you see there is Newsbank, and you can subscribe to Newsbank. But if you have, so for any of our Oregon people, if you have a Multnomah library card, you can actually access the Historic Oregonian for free using online from home using your Multnomah County library card. So that's one thing to look for. Also, universities who are trying to digitize their newspaper collections. Sometimes I will just Google Oregon historical newspapers or Washington historical newspapers, because historical societies or other organizations are trying to digitize newspapers. So don't be afraid to Google those keywords as well. But those are my main go-to. So here's some of those name variations that we talked about. Other search engine databases. So these are just some other tips. Try just the surname field or just the first name field. So in this one, this search engine is the Washington State Digital Archives. And I'm going to give you an example here. So I have an ancestor here, William Lewis Herndon Fraser, and I for the longest time couldn't find anything about his death. So I Googled Washington's, death information, and I found this great website called Washington State Digital Archives. And this is one reason to use Google, because there are so many different little databases that states and other organizations will create. So I will just Google Minnesota death certificates or something like that. And I often find these little databases that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. So one of them is the Washington State Digital Archives. And I typed in, his name's William Lewis Herndon Fraser. He's named after a captain. So he has all these names. I don't know what they decided to put down. Did they do William Lewis Herndon Fraser? Did they do WLH Fraser? Did they do blah, 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 blah? I don't know. So I decided to just do Fraser. And it does bring up a lot of entries, but this is pretty quick to go through. I can just kind of come through here and I'm like, okay, no, I'm just going to skip to the end and go back one page. And I'm going to look at W's. Aha, William Lewis Herndon Fraser. And here also, if you go back, it has the periods all next to each other with no spaces. Whereas this guy's got spaces, and I think that was why it was messing me up. So instead of just going, I just typed in Fraser and just went down the list. And then I found his death entry here. Charge subscription fees. All these databases, the ones, it depends on the databases. The Washington State Digital Archive does not charge. It's all free. Ancestry.com does charge. Family Search is free. Genealogy Bank is not free. Newspaperdust.com is not free. But a lot of public libraries offer, you can get access to them for free if you just visit the library. Also, certain states that come up with their own little databases, those are often free because they're just putting the information out there. So it just depends. But in my next webinar, I'll be able to tell you some of these major ones and how much they cost. All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. Don't be afraid to use the keyword field, and the for example, on Genealogy Bank, it has a place for, when you're searching newspapers, it has a place for a first name, a place for last name, and then it has keywords. And you automatically want to put first, use the first name and this last name. But I've actually had success by finding individuals by using the keyword field and typing in their name than I have with using the last name search box. And I'm not quite positive why this is, but it's one reason is I know of these things is sometimes they bring up records that, even just not with newspapers, but they just bring up records where my ancestors mentioned. It's not necessarily about him, but records that they're mentioned in. So don't be afraid to use the keyword box. Also try multiple search engines. So I often will use, if I can't find an individual on a census record in Ancestry.com, I'll look in the same database on Family Search and I'll find the individual. And this is because the way something's been transcribed, it also has to do with their searching algorithm when programmed. And we'll go into more detail with that in my next webinar. But I often have had great success by searching the same database or the same newspaper or whatever in a different database, all because of the searching algorithm and also how it was transcribed. So those are a few more tips. All right, in closing, is there any questions so far before we do a really big case study? Okay. So this case study is very fun, and we'll try to go through it very systematically so it makes sense. I had an individual contact me looking for their grandmother, Horace. Don't you love that? I would never name a child Horace, but Horace Constance, or they would call her Connie, I would hope so, Williams, born in 1891 in Missouri and died in 1981 in Portland, Multnomah, Oregon. And she was married, he told me, 6 times, as far as he knew. But he didn't know all of the husband's names. He only knew 4 of them. So what he told me was that she was raised by her grandmother in Missouri at the age of 9. Now, this is a very exaggerated, I don't know what to say. Not a lot of our ancestors are married 6 times, but there's a lot of, in this case study, I show off a lot of the tips that I just told you about. So that's why we're going to use it. She was married for the first time at the age of 16 to an Avery Perry. And so over here, number 1, I have Avery Perry, that they were married about 1907. So if she was 16 when they were married, 1891 was when she was born. I know that they're married about 1907. He died, excuse me. They had a daughter, Thelma Perry, Lazar Lear Perry, and he then died 17 months later, is what I was told. All right. Then she was married 5 more times, but my client knew that she had lived in Kansas in 1911, and that in 1920, she, according to the census, she was married to a Dr. R.U. Larzalier. So that's why I think Thelma's middle name or name inherited was Larzalier. So on the right there, I have that they were married prior to 1920. So this is using the information that I know and bouncing off other information. So I do know that they would have had been married before 1920 because they appear married in the 1920 census. She became a nurse in Southern California at some point, and then he told me that before 1938, she was married to a Bruce Alder Bates, and there he was before 1938, and that by 1950 she was married to a James C. Hayden, and she died in 1981. All right, is everybody following along so far? These 6 marriages, all right? Okay, so I'm going to use this information to find the next, all 6 of the marriages. Now, there are many. This can seem kind of overwhelming because it's like, where do I start? Where do I begin this process? Remember, one of the tips was where is starting with the information that you know for sure. Now, he told me all this information, but the one that's the most recent event and the one I know for positive is that I know she died in 1981 as Connie Hayden. So I'm going to look up her obituary. So I come here to the Oregonian search engine and I type in Connie Hayden. And I know that she died in 1981. So I put in there you can see right here, it dates 1981. I don't find anything. So then I try a different name variation and I try Constance Hayden, 1981. And here I found her obituary. Constance Hayden, a retired Emmanuel Hospital nurse, died in Portland Hospital August 9th. She was 89. Mrs. Hayden, who lived in Southwest Portland, was born in Missouri and first became a nurse in Los Angeles in 1914. She lived in Portland area for 48 years. There's a lot of really great tips that actually, even though I don't learn about any of her marriages in here, I find some other great information about her that I can use. So let's keep going. I'm going to look for the marriages. So she lived an extended period of time in Oregon. So I'm going to go to the Oregon Marriage Index, which I showed you earlier. Search all records, scroll down, click on Oregon Marriage Index here. So I put in James C. Hayden as the person because I don't know what her previous name was prior to this marriage. I'm not putting in Constance Hayden because I'm not looking for a Constance Hayden. I'm looking for James C. Hayden, married to a Constance, somebody, whatever her last name is at the time. So I search and I find lots of James Haydens, but none of them married to a Constance. Okay. So I'm like, okay, I'll come back to this. Let's look up Bruce. Hello, Bruce. Okay. And I type in, I noticed that her last name, let's assume that she married James Hayden after she was married to Bruce. So perhaps her last name was Bates at the time of the marriage. So I'm going to search for a Constance Bates. I find a Connie Bates married to, look like Elvis Presley. It's Ernest Presley. Jerry Walters. Okay, none of them look right. So, okay, so I'm going to go back. But during that process, I did find the couple in the 1930 U.S. Census living in Portland. So I update my information. I now know that she was married to a Bruce Alder Bates before 1930. So I'm going to go back to my notes here, make sure that I'm following along here. I'm going to type in Bruce's name into the marriage index because, again, I don't know what her married name, what her last name was prior to marrying Bates. So I'm going to search there, and I'm not finding anything. So this isn't very successful search, but I'm trying to show you all these different ways to try and find, okay? I decide to look up Washington marriage records because I know that she was married. She lived in Vancouver, Washington in 1920. So if I'm lost, I'm confused, where do I go? Nothing's coming up. I look at my notes, and my notes tell me, you can't see them, but they say that in 1920, she was living in Vancouver, Washington, married to a Dr. R.U. Larzalier. Okay, I do know that. So I'm going to use that information, look for them, Washington marriage records. So back in this, I type in Larzalier because I have an R.U. Larzalier. I don't know what his first name is. I just type in Larzalier, and I find this physician application and registers for Ray Larzalier. And I don't find anything about the marriage on here, but what I do notice here is that he became a physician from the University of Southern California while attending University of Southern California. And that I remembered, if you remember me saying at the beginning, she became a nurse in Southern California, down here. So probably that's how they met, and that's probably where they were married, and that's why I can't find a marriage on them. I then come back here, I'm like, okay, well, maybe if they were if Constance and Dr. Larzalier were living in Washington, perhaps she was married to the next spouse in Washington. So I type in Bruce Bates in here, and in marriage records, I find a Bruce A. Bates married to a Constance H. Condent. All right, we found a new surname. And here the marriage record tells me that they were married actually in Multnomah County, Oregon. And the reason why they show up in the Washington State Digital Archives is because a lot of Portland people got married or got their licenses in Vancouver because there was no waiting time like there was in Portland. But here I find the Bruce A. Bates married to a Constance Condent, and this gives me another clue. It also gives me the year. So if we come back here, I've updated my information that I know that Bruce Alder Bates, they were married in 1926, and that she would have been married to a Condent prior to Bates, prior to 1926. So let's see here. I want to find this marriage now. I want to find this marriage between Constance and a Condent, if I'm saying that right. So I go back to the Oregon Marriage Index because I didn't find anything in the Washington State Digital Archives. And I type in Constance Condent, and it brings up an Allan C. Condent, married on the 24th of December, 1926. It also brings up the same Allan C. Condent, married on the 16th of August, 1923. That's my birthday, August 16th. Anyways, but it doesn't tell me who Allan C. Condent is marrying. It just tells me there's an Allan C. Condent. So I then search for a Constance Larzalier because that was the marriage prior to this Condent, and that's what her married name would have been. And I find a Constance H. Larzalier, married 16th of August, 1923. So now I know that Allan C. Condent is his name, is who she married. I hope this is making sense. I know there's a lot of marriages in here. But this is just a way to show all these different variations using the information that I already know to bounce off of. All right, so we have 5 marriages here. Where is that 6th husband? And where would he fit? We know exactly when she married from Allan to C. Condent. We know that she married from Larzalier to Condent. We know she married from Condent to Bates. So there could be a marriage between Bates and Hayden, and there could be a marriage between Perry and Larzalier. I decided I'm like, okay, where do I start? How do I find? What am I looking for? And I recognized, I haven't found her in the 1910 U.S. Census. I need to find that before I do anything else. So where is that 1910 U.S. Census? I type in Constance Perry, born in 1891 in Missouri. And this is what pulls up. No constants. So I go back, and this goes to trying different information and pulling out what we know. I say constants, and I decided to not put in her last name, because what if she wasn't Perry? I leave it empty. And I put 1891 Missouri. Now, there could be a lot of constances from Missouri in 1891. So I want to narrow it down. I know that she had a daughter by 1910. So under the search field, family member's child, I put Thelma. This then brings up a Constance Lenhart or Lenhart, age 18, born about 1892 in Missouri. And look down below, as a Constance Lenhart, 18, with a daughter named Thelma, who's 1 year old, and she's widowed. I know this is her for sure because of that. I mean, this is Constance and Thelma. Those are two unique names. But this, and also look at her home place. It says Kansas. And my client told me that he knew that she lived in Kansas at some point around that time frame. So now I have a Lenhart. And before 1910, she was married to a Lenhart. That's about as far as I got just using online. I could probably find more if I contacted historical societies or got some death certificates and things like that. But just searching online, only using search engines that I had access to, I was able to find all 6 marriages mostly, at least their names and general time frames that they were married. So that's like I said, that's kind of a big case study. Most of our ancestors aren't married 6 times, but when we return to what we know, when we use the information we already have, when we use other family members like children, like Thelma, and if we use the search databases strategically, we can often find a lot more information than if we just went to the search engine and typed in the person's name. This helps us be an active researcher to create goals and set trajectory. So that's my little tips for the day. That's a lot of information to absorb. I hope that it was helpful, that it made sense. But these kinds of tips will really move you forward and to finding more information that we're looking for. I will send you the handout and you can go and try the different tricks. So one of them, maybe it's, I'm going to focus on the completing whole families, or maybe today I'm going to focus on looking at what databases are available just there in my database on Ancestry.com. What years are they covering? What places are they covering? That's my goal today. Just focus on 1 or 2 of these tips at a time to figure it out. And as you do it, you'll get better and better at using them all together. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will send you the recording and you can review this whole thing again along with the handout. Judy, we will add you to our newsletter. Kenneth is in charge of that, so we will do that. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for coming. Any questions at anything? It doesn't have to be related to what we just talked about. You can throw your family history questions out there. We can add them to, we have their emails when they signed up. So you don't need to put your emails in there if you're not comfortable with that. We have that there when you signed up. Okay, Kathleen, great. Any other questions? I think I will stop sharing this. And I will stop the recording.